Hello, everyone. My name is David Elwood, and I'm the Dean of the John F. Kennedy School of Government. Welcome to the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum here at the Kennedy School. We have an extraordinary panel before us today, and I will not delay you too long from that endeavor. But before we turn to that panel, I wanted to begin by introducing someone who I think many of you will come to know quite well. We are very fortunate to have a new director of the Institute of Politics, as Jean Shaheen has left to engage in politics, something that we certainly have to acknowledge and admire. And she's being replaced, and we're very honored today to have Congressman Jim Leach, who served for 15 terms in the United States Congressman as a United States representative from eastern Iowa. Now, Congressman Leach is a remarkable character, indeed is one of the most knowledgeable members of the U.S. Congress on issues around everything from international relations to other kinds of major policy. He could easily be a member of the panel tonight, but in fact, he's going to be here as the Director of the Institute of Politics for the next year. He is the winner of many, many awards, but I'll just highlight one or two of them. The Wayne Morse Integrity in Politics Award, the Edgar Wayburn Award by the Sierra Club, the Liberty Award, the Congressional Award for Commitment to the Principles of the UN Charter, and so on and so forth. He has even been elected to the Wrestling Hall of Fame. Now, I'm not certain that I totally understand that, but at some point you'll have to be sure and ask him. So he is here along with his wife, Elizabeth. We are enormously fortunate to have a man of great intelligence, a great wisdom, real humility, a Midwesterner, and someone who will lead us forward at this great Institute of Politics. Please give a warm welcome to Congressman Jim Leach. How many people, for example, do you know have honorary degrees from Virginia Theological Seminary and the Moscow Academy of Economics? In any case, let me now turn this podium over to my predecessor, Joseph Nye. He's one of just 3 deans up on the podium here today. Graham Allison to his left is also one. But Joe Nye served for 8 years as dean of the Kennedy School. Did a spectacular job, and along the way he also worked on little issues like inventing soft power or getting involved with major issues throughout the globe. So let me say no more than that, and let me turn it over to Joe Nye, one of the great members of the Kennedy School community and a great citizen. Joe Nye, welcome. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, David, and let me also add my welcome to Jim Leach, who has always stood for the best in Congress and public service. This is a man who, on whatever issue you were going to get a reasonable position, whether you agreed with it or disagreed with it, it was reasonable. We're delighted to have you here. And let me also welcome Megan O'Sullivan, who has left the White House staff yesterday, or early this morning, and is also an IOP fellow this year and has just come from working on the issue of Iraq, so well placed. A little bit too recent arrival to be on this side, but we're glad to have you there in the front row. Our aim tonight is to have a conversation about where we are in Iraq, where we will be in Iraq, and we have an interesting group of people to carry out that conversation. Let me quickly introduce them. You've got some description of them, but Graham Allison, immediate to me, to my left, my predecessor as dean, and now head of the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs, and a former Assistant Secretary of Defense. Linda Bilmes, to his left, former Assistant Secretary of Commerce, who's teaching budgeting and finance here at the school, and has written a very interesting article with Joe Stiglitz, appraisal of the costs of the Iraq War. General Tad Olstrom, to her left, is a lecturer in public policy here. Joined our faculty in 2001 after 35 years in the United States Air Force, retiring as a 3-star lieutenant general. To Tad's left is Sarah Sewell, who's director of our Carr Center for Human Rights Policy at the Kennedy School and was Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Peacekeeping and Humanitarian Affairs from 93 to 96, and before that had worked for Senate Majority Leader George Mitchell. And finally, at the end of the line is Clay Shaw, former congressman who represented South Florida in the House of Representatives for 26 years, very impressive record. He ended his career as the second most senior Republican on the House Ways and Means Committee. And during his time here at the Institute of Politics, he's going to lead a study group on the real story of how our laws are made and implemented. So we have an interesting panel here for you. And as I said, we're not going to have little speeches. We're going to have conversations among ourselves, basically replying to questions that I'm going to put. Then we're going to throw it open to you, the audience, for your questions after about 45 minutes or so. But let me say in setting the scene that we've just been through a quite extraordinary week of high political theater. You had a dramatic appearance by a high-ranking general and ambassador before the Congress on an issue which has been polarizing the country for several years now, and in which there is not a consensus in the country. Polls show a variety of different answers depending on how the questions are asked. And if there's confusion in this country about Iraq, it's perhaps because Iraq is confusing, that nobody quite knows the answer. The question I think that might help to start our little discussion is, how much did the political theater of the last week, the Petraeus and Crocker report, change anything? Or are we back where we were before it? Later, I'm going to ask more detailed substantive issues about Iraq per se, but it might be interesting to get some perspective on what was it we saw and heard over the last week. Did it change any views here in the United States? Did it change any facts that we will find on the ground in Iraq? One way to test that would be for me to ask each of you for a 10 or 15 second reply. How many troops will the next president find on the ground in Iraq on January 21st, 2009? Graham?
Approximately 100,000.
Linda?
I would also say about 100,000, but I would point out that whether it's 100,000 or 130,000 or 30,000, in terms of the total cost of the war, it's not going to make much difference.
Mm-hmm. Ted?
80 to 100,000.
Sarah?
110, and it's not going to change the vote count in Congress.
Clay?
I'd go with the general. I think we're going to probably break 100,000 and whittle it down. The president does not want to leave this for the next president in the situation that we have today.
Okay, so I interpret that as meaning that any question that this is leading to either the withdrawal of troops by the next election is out of the question. Nobody on the panel thinks that's going to happen. Is the strategy going to be different? In other words, as the troop level goes down, is it going to be the strategy which General Petraeus described, which was clear, hold, build? Is that going to be the strategy? Or will it be another strategy aimed at a lower level of troops, such as the training and basically some degree of force protection, but a much less ambitious strategy that, for example, Senator Jack Reed, a graduate of the Kennedy School, has recommended, but which has been highly criticized by, well, let's say, the Weekly Standard and Fred Kagan and others as saying that it's not feasible, that you can't go to that kind of a strategy. It just won't work. Rand?
Well, I think, Joe, your first question and this one go together. And just to remind people, there were 130,000 Americans, approximately, soldiers and Marines, in Iraq last fall when the Great Debate began. There was then the decision in January for a surge that brought 5 combat brigades equaling about 30,000 people there. Those 30,000 people were scheduled for withdrawal from Iraq on a schedule that began no later than April of '08 and concluded no later than July of '08. And that's exactly the result that the president then referred to in his speech on Thursday, saying that it was driven by success, but it was actually driven by the organizational gravity of the decisions that had been made previously, given how many combat brigades exist. So that's step one. Step two, what do they do when they're there, the mission? And Petraeus' idea about the mission is quite different than the idea of the Iraq Study Group or of Senator Jack Reed, as you said. Petraeus is basically fighting a counterinsurgency in which he wants to clear and hold and then build. And the question is, when he gets down to 130,000, can he continue trying to do that? I think he can. Will he shift to a different mission under President Bush? I don't think so. I think he believes that this is a mission that he's going to be able to sustain. And I think the hooker in all this is, if you try to think about whoever becomes president in January 2009, they're going to inherit a mess about as bad as the mess is today. And then they're going to have to consider, well, what do I do when they're a watch in their period? And I think it's quite possible that they will continue to try to clear, hold, and build, because the alternative will be to draw down faster, and you'll get back to something like the National Intelligence Estimate, in which security continues to deteriorate. So I think it's as I've written somewhere else, it's almost like a poison chalice that's going to be inherited by whoever's the new president and whatever their views.
So not much different numbers for you, not much difference in strategy. Linda?
Well, I think if I could shift a little bit to think about the cost. I mean, the cost of this war are enormous, and one of the reasons is because the total number of troops who have been deployed and involved in Iraq and Afghanistan to date is over 1.5 million. So when we focus on whether there are 130,000 in Iraq at this moment or 160,000, we're kind of missing the point of the large group of troops who have been deployed in this, because every time there are troops there, there are also troops who are back here who are being trained, and there are troops who are being prepared to go back out. So the real question is how many troops in total before we finally come back from Iraq will have been deployed in the operation. Will it be 1.6 million? Will it be 1.8 million? Will it be 2 million? Because for each one of those troops, there are several layers of cost. There's the cost of deploying a troop, which is about $275,000 a year. Then there's the cost of taking care of those troops when they come home, which is a cost that goes on for the rest of their lives. There have already been 720,000 troops who have come back, of whom more than 1/3, more than 250,000, are going for medical care through the Veterans Administration. And as we've seen, many of them are finding enormous trouble in getting the quality of care they want and in getting in to be able to see the doctors and to be able to get the disability benefits that they're entitled to. So the question really, as I see it, is how do we plan for this, which we have not done in the past, we have not planned. How do we plan for bringing these troops back and planning for taking care of the veterans and thinking about this just in a much larger sense than thinking about the 130,000 or 150,000. That simply hasn't happened up until now.
Tad, what will your 80 to 100,000 troops be doing? What will be their mission?
To take just a little different view than maybe Graham on this, I found that the strategy part of that briefing was lacking sufficiently to question the whole idea on whether or not they could continue the same strategy of conquering, holding, and building. As a result, if you remember one of the slides that General Petraeus showed, he showed some step down in terms of what forces would be doing after the initial withdrawal. And he talked about some overwatch forces. That bothers me quite a bit because overwatch forces can have lots of different definitions. He talks about a strategic overwatch, a tactical overwatch, an operational overwatch. If indeed you took this to the extension of the meaning, these overwatch forces may not be engaged at all, and it might make up a significant number or percentage of those forces that are left, which called into question in a very big way whether or not the strategy could be carried out in the same fashion it's being carried out today. And if indeed it were carried out with a large percentage or a significant percentage in overwatch tasks, that meant there's no way in the world that we would be able to continue this engagement in areas like Baghdad with the numbers that we've got today.
Sarah, you have been a consultant for General Petraeus on counterinsurgency at various times, I guess this summer or before. What will the troops be doing in terms of counterinsurgency? Petraeus is famous for his new counterinsurgency doctrine, which has been very well received as a theoretical doctrine, but applying it specifically in Iraq, what are the prospects for counterinsurgency with the level of troops that you predicted?
It's a great question, Joe. A lot of people like to equate the surge and the fact that General Petraeus has become the commander in Iraq with the implementation of the doctrine. And I think it's really important to underscore that the doctrine posited in Iraq that didn't exist at the time General Petraeus arrived on the ground. The doctrine was written for a different war than the one they are fighting now. The national intelligence estimate that speaks of it as a civil war suggests that it's gone beyond counterinsurgency. If we were fighting according to the doctrine, we'd have some 300,000 troops in Iraq, not be quibbling about 160 versus 130. If we were fighting a proper counterinsurgency in Iraq, we would have an integrated whole-of-government effort instead of a military hammer playing whack-a-mole across the country. If we were fighting in Iraq according to the counterinsurgency doctrine, we'd be seeing political progress because that would determine whether or not it would be worth continuing. So I don't think that the doctrine has ever been applied in its fulsome form in Iraq because I don't think the circumstances at the time permitted. Having said that, I think what we'll see with whatever force structure remains in the country over the next couple of years, I think we'll see a mosaic. I think we will see the continuing disintegration of the center as a political phenomenon with continued flipping and basically subcontracting of security in the periphery. And I think depending on the degree to which we accept what's going on before our eyes, which is the beginning of the fragmentation of that country, we will still be trying to conduct clear, hold, and build in pockets that we deem to require it. But I think you'll see a mix of just training and overwatch in certain areas combined with continued clear, hold, and build in areas that we can't afford to see become completely inflamed by civil war and sectarian violence. And I think we'll still have the problem of a center that doesn't politically seem to hold.
Clay, what Sarah just described was a general who's written a far-reaching plan for counterinsurgency in a country that's not providing the resources that he needs for that plan. And what are the prospects that Congress would be willing to increase resources if it turns out that the current plan, which as she describes it is inadequately staffed, is not working? Would the Congress conceivably increase numbers of troops if he asked for them?
There's so many moving parts here to begin with. When you talk about increasing the number of troops, what you're talking about is the period of time that they're allowed to be there. It used to be 12 months, it went to 15. And in order to maintain this level, it would have to go to 18. And this is something the administration does not want to do. So when people say, how long can we sustain this level, they have to keep in mind that this would take a very serious consideration by the administration on extending the tour of duties, which they clearly do not want to send these people over there for a year and a half. Many questions that come in, of course, the budgetary questions, there's all kinds of ways to determine the budget. Were you talking about wear and tear on machinery? Are you talking about health care for the veterans, rehabilitation costs? I mean, these things, and it goes on forever as to how you would build the actual budget. The Congress itself is looking at several things. And to go back to Mr. Reed's comments, What he stated is probably a goal of the administration, I would guess. But the timing is off. We're not ready to pull out of those areas. If we do, everything we've accomplished is going to go down the drain. It's like pulling your police out of an area where you've had really intensive law enforcement. Crime moves right back in when the cops leave. And we've got to be sure that all of this is coupled up with the proper training of the Iraqis so they can take over these functions for us. So Congress will be considering that as very, very much paramount. They also will be considering the political side, what is going on in there. You've got to remember that the president has a cabinet which was appointed by the parliament, not by him. And there's corruption and a lot of problems there. And Congress set down benchmarks, many of which they've met politically, many of them they've missed. But it's important to say and remember, Congress set these down, the Iraqis did not. So it's a very complicated situation. And I can tell you this Congress is very political and very complicated in itself. Unfortunately, I think there are too many in Congress that lead by following. And this has got to change.
Let me follow that up, if I may, and then also ask the same question to the other panelists. It was one of the most striking things about last week's drama before the Congress was the fact that there was a difference between the testimony of Ambassador Crocker and the testimony of General Petraeus. General Petraeus was reflecting a series of what he described as improvements or progress on the military front as a result of the surge. And when Ambassador Crocker was pressed to show similar evidence on the political side, he was pretty hard pressed. And the 18 benchmarks, if the benchmarks are not met, will the military gains prove ephemeral? In other words, if these benchmarks, like the oil law or devolution for the provinces and so forth, if this doesn't work, how will the Congress respond to that? In other words, will there be the willingness to keep pouring American troops in if there is no progress on this political benchmark front?
Well, I think that's going to be a definite consideration, and for many it's going to be a decisive consideration. But for others it would be looking really mainly at the military piece of this. This is a very fragile country, and it's been divided very much along ethnic lines. Mm-hmm. We are making progress, but progress is slow, and it's tough. And it's important that we have a certain amount of patience, but the Congress, I think, should focus more on the military side and the gains we're making, which probably will allow the political side to grow much better at a more rapid rate. Also, I think we need to look beyond just those points that we drew in the sand, other things that have to be considered.
Yeah, Grant?
Let me make a small point, maybe to try to get some disagreements as well as agreements. I think if you look at the national intelligence estimate that you can get from CIA's website from August, it says that while there's been some measurable but uneven progress on the security front, that on the political front, actually, things have regressed. So the theory of the case, which was we would have a surge that would provide an increase in security, which would make more likely political reconciliation, actually has not worked at this point. And there's no evidence that it's going to work. So I think the national intelligence estimate is, I think, done by a more independent grader than people grading their own performance, as in the case of the Petraeus 18. I think, secondly, with respect to the benchmarks, while now there's an effort to back away from the benchmarks, actually these were created by Hadley a year ago, initially. That is, Steve Hadley, the National Security Advisor, went out and said, we got to at least have some sense for whether we're going, succeeding or failing. So the 18 benchmarks are essentially the next edition, or 2 times plus the next edition of that. And they're not a final measure. I mean, there's no way to have a final grading, but one knows, for example, in any situation, you got to have some basis for trying to judge. I think they're quite reasonable basis for making some judgments. They don't tell you the whole picture. But I would think that while David Petraeus' account of the ways in which there have been some measurable but uneven success on the security front is correct, that on the political front, actually there's been no progress. And the situation, I believe, is worse, so that now the conversation, both in Baghdad and in Washington, or much of the conversation, is about whether the Maliki government can do the job or whether he may need to be replaced by some other government. So I think that's an indicator of how fragile the political situation is, in which I understand the theory of the case that if one had a security window, it's conceivable that people would make political reconciliations. But if you look at the dynamics of the political sectarian divides, the contrary theory that General Casey believed, which was you need to withdraw in order to focus their minds, in order to incentivize them to make political compromises, is equally plausible.
Ted?
Just to add another factor or two here, when we look at political achievements that have been gained in Iraq, I wouldn't say that they're all on the negative side, because one that's been very positive is the political gains that have been made at the local level, especially by our military forces. In fact, if you were to talk to our folks today, one of the most positive things that is coming back is their ability to communicate at the local level, and that's the success we've been seeing in El Anbar province. In the absence of, let's say, major political advances, checking off some of those boxes, you have to consider whether we're 2 or 3 years down the road, whether or not the zest of our military is going to be the same to continue to be engaged in Iraq, if indeed they don't see success in a major way on the political side.
Linda?
I don't know as much about all of the geopolitical ramifications as my colleagues here on the panel, but just looking at the numbers in a very crass way. Already, and we see it every day in the newspaper when we see that a police station and a recruiting station has been blown up, and we see it day after day after day. Out of the 190,000 Iraqi security police, 6,000 or more have been killed, 40,000 have been wounded. That's a pretty high number to lose. The U.S. has already spent $20 billion, which is a lot of money. That's like the annual defense budget of India. $20 billion in training and recruiting these people who are kind of the linchpin of this strategy that we are going to hand over from our forces to them. And what I would like to ask my co-panelists is, if we are losing them at this rate, how will we get anyone to do this job? Not only are we losing them, but every time we lose one, their families become refugees, their families become a humanitarian disaster. Who is going to be there?
Sarah, let me put this, Linda's question, but another one that Tad suggested to you. The administration has said, well, we might not be doing as well on the 18 benchmarks, but political progress should be looked at from the bottom up. I think Ambassador Crocker made that point. And if instead of looking at the 18 benchmarks and based on Baghdad, we look at the ground up, we can see some progress politically at that level, and Anbar has been the case in point. On the other hand, having just read The Economist last week about Kirkuk, it makes one ask, to what extent is Anbar typical or atypical? In other words, if you don't have progress on the 18 benchmarks, will the progress you're seeing in Anbar be countervailed by the kind of latent conflict that seems to be about to break out in Kirkuk, and also the conflict in the south now that the British are withdrawn from Basra to the airport?
I think the benchmarks question is really tricky. I remember when we were engaged in a humanitarian operation in Somalia, trying to think about the benchmarks that would be appropriate to come out. It was really a roll of the dice as to what should matter and what you could track, and you tended to look at the things that you could measure instead of the things that were important. And it's a very challenging proposition. I do think the question has almost two elements. I wonder if in retrospect, when we look back at the Iraq War, whether we will see the triumph that we now claim in the flipping of the tribes in Anbar as the beginning of the end. Because if the purpose of nation building is to have a stable central government, Anbar is perhaps the antithesis of that. It is the devolution of authority and the creation of a basically self-governed enclave. And I have to disagree respectfully with Tad that I'm not sure. I know that the Marines have done extraordinary work there and been enormously successful, but I think it's at least equally relevant that the folks in Anbar decided that they didn't want the rules that al-Qaeda laid down and that the Americans were the least bad enemy and they would narrow their fronts. And so they made a calculated decision. And I think when we look, the second piece of this is that when we look at other areas that we have thought to be relatively stable, whether it's Kirkuk or Basra, you can see both the divisions even within the Shia community, and you can see that even the places that are held out now as the magnet for refugees have the ability to explode. So I see the fragmentation as already occurring, and the real question is how to manage the consequences of that. And I don't know that what we take now at this snapshot of time as evidence of success will necessarily be viewed that way 10 years from now.
That does raise the larger question, or your comment raised the larger question of the future of Iraq as a centralized entity. And on the Anbar case, you could say what we're seeing is the enemy of my enemy is my friend, which is an old axiom of the region, but doesn't mean that my new friend is also friends with my other friend. So it may be that the Sunni tribes are quite happy to be with us against al-Qaeda in Iraq, but that doesn't mean they have any love for a Shia government in Baghdad and vice versa. So that is this a situation where our friends will be fighting, so to speak? And there has been for quite some time, I guess Senator Biden is most closely associated with this view, the argument that the only prospect for Iraq is a radical decentralization, a devolution to almost what we would call a confederation rather than a federation, and that until we get that, you're never going to have any prospect for political stability. That rather than 18 benchmarks in Baghdad, we've got to go think locally, but thinking locally so long as you've tied them together through Baghdad where they can fight with each other will work. So the Biden argument is, I'm not arguing for it, I'm just trying to lay it out, is that we should speed up the process of devolution, which is already occurring, so that it'd be better to make these three regional local accommodations and thereby have a better prospect for political stability. What do members of the panel think of that? Graham?
Well, I would make 2 points. First, to just follow up and second Sarah's point, if you look at this ABC NHK poll that was reported the weekend, while the al-Qaeda folks in Anbar are hated by the Sunnis in Anbar, so 3/4 of them hate al-Qaeda, precisely the same number hate the Americans. So if you look at the poll and just ask people, they don't like al-Qaeda and they don't like Americans equally. So I take that not to be a long-term friend. Okay? They are happy for our assistance and money for helping them fight somebody today, but tomorrow, if they've got rid of them, who else might they be interested in? Secondly, on the Biden or the devolution, or even the potential soft devolution, if there were 3 neatly divided territories, that would be a whole lot easier. But lo and behold, there's a crazy quilt patchwork. Now in Baghdad, there's already extensive ethnic cleansing. So if you're living in a mixed neighborhood, Shiite militias come and tell you you can be killed or you can move. So most people move. So there's been some divide, but still the checkerboard looks pretty complicated. And then you have lots of cities like Kirkuk, as you mentioned, which have a mixed population. And then you have the further piece that I think doesn't quite work for me in the Biden Gelb version of it, which is that somehow a central government is going to agree that the 3 regional governments will run their own regions and will divide the money to them. But the Kurds don't want to divide any of the money that they get from their oil. The Shiite don't want to divide any money that they get from their oil. The Sunnis actually think if the Americans would leave and they had an opportunity to fight, they might win. The Shiite, including Maleki, believe, oh my God, the Sunnis may actually come back. So they haven't quite resolved that. So I would say the most likely outcome as the matter devolves will be the intensification of the civil war among the parties. And I think that's the national intelligence estimate, which I think is probably the right baseline.
Does anybody on the panel argue for the Biden plan?
I'd like to comment on
Yep.
it. One of the things that no one has asked is what do the Iraqis want? And I don't think they do, as far as a complete decentralization and partitioning of the country. And I think Senator Biden is leading more in that direction than a confederation and then how close it's going to be. It's further complicated by just the geography over there. People know it's rich in oil, either second or third richest country in the world as far as oil is concerned, but also something that's even more precious in that part of the world, water. They've got great possibilities for development of vast agricultural situation, which is very unusual in that part of the world. So when you start thinking about dividing it up, how in the world would you do it? And at this point, since we are so far along on supporting democracy there, why would we try to come in and shove it down their throats? That just would be, I think, in my opinion, unthinkable and totally inconsistent with the direction that we have gone. If the Iraqis decided they wanted to do it, then that would be quite another thing. But I don't think there is a certain amount of national pride over there. I think we saw it in the soccer team and various other things that have happened over the years.
If you look at public opinion polls in Iraq, it's a difficult place to do good random sample polling, but the polls do tell something. And as you mentioned, there is this recent poll taken. One of the things that struck me most is that when the Americans first went into Iraq, polling showed that 60% welcomed the Americans. Today, the poll that I saw showed that 60% thought it was all right to kill Americans. Not that we weren't welcome, but to kill Americans. That sounds like a quite dramatic step in the wrong direction over the last 3 years, from the poll in 2003 to today. From a counterinsurgency point of view, Sarah, if the numbers of public opinion are running in that way, what are the prospects for actually being able to develop the kind of counterinsurgency where you win hearts and minds of the population? You clear, you hold, and you build. Will those polls change again to 60% welcoming us if we clear, hold, and build?
The short answer is I don't think those polls are likely to reverse the trajectory they're currently traveling. I think you may find pockets in which the Americans are no longer the prime irritant because it's become an intra-Shia battle in Basra, for example. There may be places where the Americans are no longer the issue and therefore engendering that level of hostility. But I think the thought that hearts and minds are there for the Americans to win it all is really a chimera, and I think that the way forward is for Iraqis to win hearts and minds at the local level and hope that the populations are homogenous enough that it won't entail great bloodletting. But that, I think, is managing the consequences of a series of ill-fated decisions, because even those who opposed the war, and I would put myself in this category, those who opposed the war are still saddened by the fact that it was handled as badly as it was, so that this is the point that we are now. And I think it would take an extraordinary infusion and a redoubling of effort to change that dynamic, and I don't think in any way, shape, or form that's in the cards.
Do any of you, before I turn to the audience, but as a last short question, do any of you have an optimistic view of what the Iraq situation will look like, let's say, in 2010 or 2012? In other words, if you look out beyond this immediate problem, what would you say is not the very long term, because nobody knows the very long term, but you look out, let's say, 4 years or so, any prognosis that's more optimistic than what we've heard so far? Grant?
I can't qualify as optimistic, but I would say Hobbes got it right when he said life will be poor, nasty, brutish, and short.
Linda?
Well, I would say that the only area in which I have any optimism is in the north. The Kurds have just announced a major oil deal with Hunt Oil and seem to be essentially going on their own to develop an oil infrastructure and reaching out around the world. It is conceivable that things could be better there in 4 years.
Mm-hmm. Pat?
I'm an optimist, but barely, which is kind of hard to quantify, but I really do.
Well, no, don't quantify it, but describe it.
I really think that where the inroads have been made, I think they can be sustained. I think we've got huge problems yet to understand the Shiite piece, because in the absence of the British, that's going to end up being one of our jobs, if you would, a U.S. job, and we don't understand the Shiite versus Shiite problems. I think the North will continue to prosper. So I think there is some optimism in those areas.
Sarah?
I can paint a scenario in which we've managed the consequences not horrifically, and that would involve a much more regionalized approach to Iraq. It means reaching out to Iran and to Turkey to create rules of the road for the relative independence or continued independence of the Kurdish area. It would require a huge investment of carrots and sticks for countries in the region to think about holding the mixed areas somewhat stable and minimizing Iranian influence. It's about consequence management, and I think part of the problem with the pageantry of the last week has been that we have continued to persist in sort of a frozen equilibrium as opposed to seeing the trajectory before us and making conscious choices about how to manage it.
Clay?
Well, I would have to say I'm optimistic, but very cautious optimistic. I think that's what I said before I lost the last election I ran in. But the whole attitude, I think, is one of the theme really has to be set by the United States government speaking with the Congress, and I can understand a lot of the concern that the Iraqis have with some of the rhetoric that's coming out of Washington. States like we've lost the war. That can do absolutely no good for this country. But I think what we need to ask ourselves, what are the consequences of losing? If we lose, who wins? And what is that going to happen? Who's going to come in and fill that vacuum? And what in the world is going to happen with, they've got some very dangerous neighbors over there too. And not only will all of the things that we have done unravel, but also it'll make it tremendously dangerous, much more dangerous in that part of the world. Then you have to go even further than that and look at our commitments to Israel and those countries, and how can we sustain those commitments if we cut and run. So I think regardless of where you stand as far as whether we're there, should be there or not, and I can tell you right now, that knowing what we know today, the Congress would never have voted for that particular resolution. But having been there, what are the consequences of leaving? And I think that's unthinkable.
And for the two of you who are relatively optimistic, or mildly optimistic, imagine that between now and 2012, it's discovered that Iran has developed a nuclear weapon, and we decide to attack Iran's nuclear facilities. What will that do to your optimism about Iraq?
Thanks for the softball.
No, is there a prospect for Iraq if we attack Iran? I mean, Iran, you used to ask who wins from this war. Most people say so far Iran has been the winner from the war.
Well, I think you've really asked me a military question, which I really
So we
not
duck to
capable
the
of doing.
general?
So I will toss the ball over to the
All right, Ted.
to the general. He is in the Air Force. so he
I would think it could be a win for Iraq. In other words, it'll set back Iran for some period of time, but I think it'll be a big loss for the United States. And it's kind of hard to wrestle with those two things, but you could see where Iraq could stand on their feet and progress, no longer being threatened, if you would, from the same Iran that was.
And Iran will not be able to retaliate against the U.S. by manipulating its own groups within Iraq?
The answer is yes, they will, but I still think that, as I mentioned, the U.S. is going to be the big loser, but Iraq might have a chance to survive.
Grant?
If we're stretching for optimism here, this is now not on the nuclear piece, but on the earlier. If you imagine a serious diplomatic surge of the sort that the Iraq Study Group recommended, and then serious conversation between the U.S. and Iran about the future of Iraq, if the U.S. withdraws and you get an intensification of the civil war in Iraq and chaos, that's bad. It's horrible for us, as Clay said, but it's also bad for Iran. They have on your border a raging civil war in which the Shiite are fighting Sunnis who are being supported by the Saudis and others. And if we've gotten out of there, actually playing a spoiler role in a civil war from a distance is pretty easy by providing money or stingers as we did in Afghanistan or some supplies. So I would say that if the Iranians were thinking about their interest, they should be interested in the stabilization of an Iraq under a Maliki, Shiite-dominated government, which happens to be our objective. I mean, strangely as the scene goes. So in terms of the interests of the parties, there's some alignment, at least with respect to Iraq, that a diplomatic surge might engage. Now, I don't think President Bush wants to go there, but I could imagine that, if you said, what would change the political dynamics in such a way that you might get some kind of accommodation in Baghdad? That would be about it's a slender reed, but about the best reed.
After that brilliant Model 1 analysis, I'm tempted to ask you how, or why it hasn't already happened, but in fact, we've reached the end of our panel participation, and it is now time for audience participation. You will find 2 microphones on the floor and 2 in the balcony. You can line up behind them. I'd like you to identify yourself when you're recognized, state your relationship to the university, and to ask a brief question pointed to one particular panel member. And let me also remind you that questions are short and they come with a question mark at the end. In other words, no speeches. So, yeah.
Thank you and good evening.
And 1 per customer.
Yes. My name is Bill Berkowitz. I come from outside of Harvard. I have no Harvard affiliation. I'm here as a citizen, simply, and I appreciate Harvard making these forums public. About 4.5 years ago, almost to the day, I was here at a panel discussion that I believe you moderated, Professor Nye. It was just before the Iraq War started. There was a distinguished panel here, none of whom, Professor Nye will correct me, said at that time that we should not enter Iraq. 4.5 years later, there's an equally...
I think Brian Hare was on that panel, and he most distinctly said not. Anyway, go ahead.
Perhaps stand corrected. 4.5 years later, we have an equally distinguished panel in front of us, and my question is, not what the people in the panel think will happen by the time of the next election, 100,000 troops or better, I heard in the opening round, but rather what they think should happen, and specifically, are there any of you sitting before us who would, 1 or more of you, who would come forward and say that there should be no troops in Iraq, U.S. troops in Iraq, by the time of the next election? Thank you.
Good question, nice and clear, and also who would say no troops by the end, let's say, let's use the same date, January 21st, 2009.
That is to say that
Not your prediction, your preference. I think that was the question, which is your preference, not your prediction. To go down to 0 by January 21st, 2009, or the beginning of the next presidency. Nobody?
let me try. I'm not sure because I'm of multiple minds, but I would say that a rapid withdrawal that might leave a couple of battalions in Kurdistan and might leave a couple of battalions out in a basing area in order to be able to go over the right, or in order to be able to work with CIA and special forces in counterterrorism, leaving the Iraqi dynamics to its own forces and trying to damage limit the spread of the war, I would say would be the best short-term outcome. But I think given the realities of 60 and 67, so 60 votes are required in the Senate to even have a vote, to even pass a vote on anything, and 67 are required to overturn a veto, that this is an academic conversation, because that's not going to happen.
No, but the question was preference, and you answered very clearly. It can't be 0, but pretty close to it. Sarah?
And I would just say that to me, a huge piece of the answer is as we begin drawing down, which I believe we must, how does the dynamic change? The only reason I can't say I want to see 0 in 2 years is because I don't know what's going to transpire between now and 2 years. I think we have to change the dynamic. I think we have to start pulling combat brigades out now. But I think we have to, again, manage those consequences in the absence of having a better understanding of how events will unfold. I wouldn't want to prejudge precisely where we'd be.
Just as a reality check, it's almost impossible to think we could actually do that to bring out those troops in that period of time. I mean, it would be quite senseless, I think, to even attempt it.
And there's also the issue of the cost of actually bringing the troops home, dismantling bases, and transporting hundreds of thousands of pieces of equipment and not allowing them to fall into al-Qaeda hands, which is not to say that, I mean, I personally would favor as rapid as possible of a drawdown, but going forward, as we have had up until now an almost sort of free menu of options. I mean, I would favor looking at how we can actually manage in a cost-efficient way to bring home the troops and the equipment.
On that, just as a footnote, I think the analysis that Larry Korb did, which was published by CAP last week, gives a pretty good account of how, if you were just serious about getting out, in a year you can get our folks out, you can move your equipment into Kuwait, and some of the equipment you're going to give to a government that continues to fight there anyhow.
Left side of the balcony.
My name is Dan Metzel, and I'm a freshman at the college. My question is directed towards Mr. Allison or any of the other panelists who wish to answer. Obviously, the current chaos in Iraq is going to have lasting repercussions within that country, but from a perhaps more selfish perspective, how do you see the current situation and the possible scenarios that may play out affecting U.S. foreign policy and influence in the region and maybe in the entire world over the next decade or two?
Okay, a very good question and too hard, but just trying to be telegraphic. First, what have been the consequences of the war in Iraq on U.S. influence and position in the world already? And the answer is a country that began in 2003 with the best reputation for reliability and respect has fallen further and faster than any country in history. So look at any of the polls. And secondly, that a country that had a reputation of being essentially benevolent, or more or less benevolent, and more or less competent, has now got a reputation that it can't successfully fight a war. So that's where we are today, and as this situation continues, that situation is not going to be reversed unless something miraculous happens, which I don't think is going to happen. So going forward, If and as we damage limit in Iraq, which is not going to be a great victory, and it's hardly going to be a success, but if one could get back to some level of approximate stability, or even if one could get to a controlled civil war, or that is a civil war within Iraq that's kind of like what it is today, but slightly more intense, but that doesn't spill over. And if we then concentrated that attention on Al-Qaeda and concluding the job of eliminating the group that attacked us on 9/11 and trying to prevent the spread of that war, I think we're still going to be digging out of a very deep hole for a very long time. So it's not a good scenario, but the continuation of the current situation is not good either. And if I thought that the continuation of the current situation offered some light at the end of the tunnel, I would be more hopeful, but I'm not hopeful.
Let me turn to the balcony on the right side.
Shaloha. My name is Ari Cole, and I'm a mid-career here at the Kennedy School. I'd like to thank the panel for a very academic discussion and very fraternal and collegial. My question is to the General and Professor Sewell. Iran has been in the press recently noted by our government that they've been sending Iranian munitions and bombs into Iraq and destabilizing the region, in addition to proliferating possible nuclear technology to fruition soon. How do you see the U.S. responding if the armaments increase and destabilize the region, and or they get closer to fruition with their nuclear plans and desires?
Tad and Sarah, you were both recipients of the invitation to comment.
I think there's already been some response. There's been some repositioning of troops, maybe in particular Iraqi troops, onto the border between Iraq and Iran. A realization that they're going to have to patrol that border much more closely than they have in the past. I don't see any drastic actions happening relative to an invasion of Iran or a major strike into Iran, realizing that nobody will admit that that option is taken off the table. But the fact is that we will continue to manage the small pieces of that in order to restrict the flow of weapons. I think it's just as important to think about the flow of weapons out of Iran to Syria or to Hezbollah in other locations. That's probably more important to stability of the Middle East than even the flow across the border into Iraq. But I think it's going to be marginal steps that make some common sense to cut down the flow, continue to isolate, if possible, Iran. There's a meeting coming up, I think, in the United Nations in the next week or so that they're going to discuss one more time sanctions or increasing sanctions, all of which I think are useful discussions to pass to the world what is happening as best we can.
You agree? Okay. On the floor, on this right side.
Alex Alexander, and I'm a mid-career Mason Fellow. The president's speech last week signaled probably a policy shift or a strategic shift towards a long-term presence in Iraq, which could possibly be inherited by not one of his successors, but several of his successors. Now, one cannot help but remember Korea. Does any of the panelists feel that there would be a long-term presence of United States in Iraq, similar to the situation in Korea?
Does anybody think that there will be, the president likes the analogy of Iraq being like Korea. Does anybody think that we will see American troops in the long term in Iraq as we've seen them in Korea? Any panelists say yes?
I say yes. Now,
Yes.
what is long term? I mean, nobody can really put your finger on that. I don't want to think of it as a Korea.
Well, decades long, I think, would be the analogy.
But I really think that a decade worth of U.S. troops in Iraq is a very high possibility. But not with the same kind of mission that you would have in Korea. I mean, there's a completely different situation.
I think the Korean analogy is interesting in the sense that if the equivalent of 50,000 troops in Iraq would actually stabilize the place in a manner consistent with our interest and without a lot of Americans getting shot every day, I think you would end up getting support for it. So I think that's what's attractive about it. I think, unfortunately, the situation in Iraq is closer to Sarah's description, I would agree with. It's an intense civil war now that's likely to get more intense. It's got, in addition, an insurgency and a Shia against Shia, Sunni against Sunni militia conflict. So I think if we end up with troops there for some considerable period of time, they'll either be doing something like what Petraeus is using them to do, be the biggest militia on the block, and every block they go to is the biggest militia. If they stay there, they can keep it relatively stable. Or they'll withdraw to bases and try to do training, in which case I think you go back to the National Intelligence Estimate and see a secular deterioration of the security situation about the pace that you saw in the last half of '06. So I think the hook on the point that you made, which impresses, which I've at least been trying to think about, and I was talking to Professor May today about this, who's teaching a course on international history. And if you think about Vietnam and how is it similar and how is it different, in Vietnam, after Johnson had concluded in 1968, after 3 years of Americanization of the war, in which we had been there with 500,000 troops, that there was no path to victory and it was time to begin withdrawing, Nixon gets elected. That's in, he comes to office in January 10, 1969. He had campaigned on a secret plan, which is basically to withdraw over the next 9 months. That was what he was planning to do. When he looked at the situation, it was clear that if he withdrew over 9 months, the place would collapse on his watch. So we continued to fight there for another 6 years to get to the 73, 74 peace negotiations, and then it was another year beyond that when the place collapsed.
Yep. Sarah?
The president's statement about Korea made me really sad, because this is a president that campaigned arguing that the United States was not going to do nation building, that it was not in our interest to do nation building. And now we're in a situation that we might be realizing what that attitude cost us. And I hope that regardless of how Iraq transpires over the course of the next 5 or 10 years, we take the lesson that a state that is destroyed requires massive infusions of all forms of national power to stabilize. And we don't indulge in the fantasy that we can create change with a light touch.
If I could step out of my moderator's role for a minute, I would just say that the analogy between Iraq and Korea is so profoundly ahistorical and flawed that anybody who engages in this would fail in their term paper at the Kennedy School. So I don't recommend it. On the left side of the floor.
Good evening. My name is Matan Khoev. I'm a researcher at the Belfer Center, and my question is for you, Professor Sewell. You've examined peace operations and peacekeeping for a long time, and the issue of the private sector's role in conflict and post-conflict environment has been a matter of much debate, both academically and in practice. Today in Iraq, the second largest member of the international coalition is the private sector, an army of contractors guarding everything from bases and anything that you'd call a noun to active combat. And this morning, we were reminded of their role when the Iraqi government suspended one of the biggest beneficiaries of this force presence, Blackwater, from operating in Iraq. After what happened was it killed 8 civilians. So my question is, from a concept of peace operations, counterinsurgency, whatever model of American response there is to the situation in Iraq, what is your assessment of the private sector's involvement and both the gains and costs it has given us? Noting that Petraeus cited specifically in January when he announced the surge plan that the private sector would play a greater role than it has in Iraq already.
It's a great question, and I think it follows on directly from the point that I just made about a nation in denial about its global responsibilities and the degree to which just because you have the world's finest and largest military doesn't mean that every problem needs that hammer. I think the reliance on contracting is in no small part a function of the United States having lost the ability to project other forms of power, whether it's communicating our ideals or building bridges or tending to animal husbandry problems of the local population that actually matter to them. And the problems that we've seen, the paper today was a very sobering reminder of the problems that exist with the use of force when it escapes the monopoly of the state and is unregulated. And I think if the tasks are important enough that they are engaged in over a long period of time by a large number of persons, then we probably ought to think about whether they're important enough to belong in our national capability, whether they're military or civilian. So while contractors will continue to play a very important and valuable role, when I was in the Pentagon in the 1990s, they were invaluable in terms of setting up mess halls and doing all kinds of non-combat operations that supported the troops that were temporary in conception and duration. I think we need to pay a great deal of attention to them and really ask ourselves whether or not we can afford to pretend we don't need to do this work and then give it to those who are essentially outside of accountability to the citizenry, but acting in our name and potentially affecting our reputation.
You want to add, Linda?
I would just add that when you think about the role of contractors in the war, there are many reasons why the war has cost so much, but one of them is clearly the fact that not only do you have 100,000 contractors, many of them in key positions throughout Iraq and Afghanistan, but the contractors' jobs have become more difficult, and they've essentially been given a free rein in pricing. Nobody really knows what it costs to do a lot of the things that they're bidding on to do, and nobody really knows how much it costs to maintain the security apparatus for the contractors. So a situation has been going on now for several years where the administration has put forward emergency supplemental appropriations, which go through very, very quickly without giving either Republican or Democratic budget analysts the chance to actually sit down and look at these requests for money and try and think about how much does it actually cost to do whatever it is that the contractors are doing. The things go through very, very quickly, and we have now funded the entire war through more than 20 emergency supplemental appropriations. And this single item has probably increased the cost of the war, the cost of combat operations by 5%.
The left side of the balcony.
Thank you. Hello, my name is Kenzie Bach. I'm also a freshman in the college. And my question, I'm afraid, is for Professor Sewell, but is open to anyone, just due to your title in the Clinton administration. Obviously, there's been a lot of discussion tonight and in the national debate about military and political objectives in Iraq. And what I'd like to know is if there are any social objectives, whether it's in the area of education or the area of infrastructure or something else, that you think are going to be particularly essential to progress in Iraq over the next 5-10 years.
I think that's a great question, and I think we missed our opportunity to shape the answer in the first couple years after major combat operations. And what we've seen is an extraordinary amount of disarray on the part of just the American side trying to think through the answer to this question, quite apart from the question of whether we're going to empower the locals to have their own solutions. But really, up until very recently, the military and the civilians were arguing about economic orthodoxies for Iraq and whether or not we should be doing privatization and shock therapy, or whether we should, because that was the reigning ideology within the Beltway, or whether we should be meeting the commander's requirements, which were to employ people and get young men off the streets. When you have that kind of disarray in your capital about what your role is vis-a-vis nation building, you get paralysis and you get efforts working at cross purposes. I think the one advantage perhaps of a bottom-up solution is that you might have greater scope, but whether or not you can actually get the resources to support local solutions, and by the way, whether or not those local solutions are going to be consistent with American values, having to do with equal rights for women, having to do with the rule of law as we understand it, raises a whole other host of challenges. And we've not really begun to even develop a clear way of thinking about those questions.
Can we do a follow-up on
Yes,
that too?
sure.
I think one of the miscalculations we made in going into Iraq was that we didn't really understand how the infrastructure within the country all relied on Saddam Hussein. And when he collapsed, that whole thing collapsed. And that was a serious miscalculation but it's one now that we've been paid for some time and will continue to pay for. But there have been some wonderful things that are happening over there that aren't really getting reported that much, opening the schools and doing things like that. But we've fallen short, there's no question about that.
On the right side of the balcony.
Sir, my name is Lieutenant Colonel Chuck East. I'm a mid-career student. My question is for Professor Allison. Given that we live in a dynamic and dangerous world, what have our potential and future adversaries learned from this, from the Iraq situation we are in now?
It's an excellent question, and I think that your premise is exactly right. We live in an extremely dangerous world, and a world that's becoming more dangerous. Now, what will they have learned from this so far? First, they've learned that we have a hammer that can destroy a regime. I mean, Iran, which fought Iraq and Saddam for 8 years to a stalemate, watched where in 3 weeks the U.S., the finest military in the world, took down that regime in 3 weeks without sweating. Okay, so that's a big deal. So we are able to destroy things. Okay, number one. Number two, after that, it gets a lot worse. Yeah? So building or post-destruction is not something that we did in this case, that we did successfully. We end up finding ourselves as occupiers, having not successfully dealt with what was first an insurgency, who looked like a group of dead-enders, but then morphed into deep sectarian divides, which were there right under the surface, and a civil war. And I would say there, the lesson is we have not been successful, and I don't believe we will be successful. Okay. So thirdly, then, should that lead governments not to mess with us? Yes, because we still have a hammer. Okay. But should it lead us to a great deal more modesty about what we can accomplish in other settings and under what circumstances we want to go around crushing things? I would say absolutely.
All right, we're running low on time. There'll be 3 more questions here, here, and here. And so your turn.
Hi, my name is Don Kurth. I'm a mid-career student here. This was touched on before, but let me maybe ask it more directly. Just as an average American who watches CNN and Fox and reads a newspaper, it looks to me like there's an argument being made in the press to either invade Iran or for maybe more likely surgical strikes to neutralize their nuclear capability. Do any of you see that, or maybe the congressman would like to answer?
Well, I think you're seeing it correctly, particularly on Fox. And I think, there are alternative plans. I'm sure, I'm not spilling the beans because I don't know any, but I'm sure that within the White House that's being thought about. It's being thought about by our generals, and plans for that are certainly probably underway. Now, I didn't say implemented. I just said I think it's very clear that we would be looking at those possibilities, but it's only a possibility. There's so many things that should be done before that. A complete naval blockade certainly would come to mind. They don't have any gas refineries of any sort in Iran. You can cut off their fuel and they'll be in big trouble.
Or will we just wake up one morning to hear on television that we have just bombed these nuclear facilities?
If it happens, that's the way it's going to happen.
Thank you.
Okay. On the other side of the floor.
Hi, my name is Daniel, and I'm a first-year policy student at the Kennedy School. My question was for Professor Sewell specifically, but also if any of the other panelists could give their wisdom on it as well. The execution of Saddam Hussein, how did that affect, or what effect did that have on the insurgency and on the war generally? And are there options that are now closed to us because that went through?
It's an interesting question, and the short answer is I don't know. I'm not sure. I think there's an interesting place where Iraqi sentiments at the time were certainly underscoring that, and I think whether or not the U.S. could have usefully change the course of events there without appearing to prevent the Iraqis from having an Iraqi solution is a fair question. But I don't honestly know to what degree it foreclosed negotiation options. I think that would be a great PhD.
I just make a frivolous aside, but to the whatever extent we thought that a better option would be to dust him off, bring him back, and leave him with the problem, it eliminated that option. Yeah.
Final question on the left balcony.
My name's Julia Bertelsmann, and I'm a junior at the college now. I'd like to ask Professor Linda Bilmers a question about the cost of the war. Of course, in economics, one never analyzes the cost of taking an action without weighing it up against the cost of not taking that action, or the cost of taking an action without weighing it up against the cost of taking a different action. Do you think that sending 130,000 troops cost us less than sending 500,000 troops immediately would have? Do you think that having a military presence in the Persian Gulf, which is something America seems to, or perhaps needed, or needs, is costing us more than not having any influence or presence in the Persian Gulf? I'd like to ask you some counterfactual questions.
Nice question of a student who understands opportunity cost. You're the professor.
The question of the counterfactual of what could we have spent the money on is a very interesting question. It's a very good question, and one that my co-author, Joe Stiglitz, has spent quite a lot of time trying to think about. You know, we have, I mean, the cost of the war exists on several levels. You have the cost, the sort of budgetary cost of the war. There's the long-term cost of the war. There's the sort of social cost of the war in terms of impairment of quality of life. And they're the kind of macroeconomic cost of the war. And probably we've done the most counterfactual work in terms of the macro cost. And just to take one element, the price of a barrel of oil was $23 a barrel on the day of the invasion. It's now hit 80. And if we just looked at the counterfactual in terms of the impact on the U.S. economy of just $5 of that, if we only attributed $5 of that cost to an impact on the economy, then that would have cost us about $450 billion. So the question is, when you're looking at these very large amounts of money, you know, if we bought a war for $1 trillion or $2 trillion, you think about what could we have done with that money. There are many, many different options, you know, ranging from the kind of trite, you know, you could sort of pay every Iraqi a certain amount of money, to the, you know, large kinds of restructuring programs that we've seen through the Marshall Plan. But I think that it's a very important question to think, and as we think about this war, to think how much money we have spent and what could have been done. And whether it's the $20 billion in reconstruction money that was not spent, or it's the $2 trillion for the war overall, which has been misspent, this is a question that will be with us for many, many years.
Could I just refine my question a bit? I was more interested in wondering what you think the cost of not having the war would have been. You know, the cost of not having any influence in the Persian Gulf. You know, America has wonderful relations with Egypt and Jordan. It has terrible relations with every country in the Persian Gulf, almost. Or it has very little influence in Iraq and Iran. Perhaps this war will help it provide some deterrent to Iran in future. I wonder what you think the cost of not having this war, or of, you know, having a bigger war, would have been.
Well, I'm going to ask my colleagues, if we spend $1 trillion in the Middle East on other things, what do you think we could have achieved?
Well, I'll take not that part, but the other half of it. If you take the position that Colin Powell held at the time of 2003, the argument, or 2002, and that I think was quite a common view in the national security community, Saddam Hussein was a terrible tyrant who was beastly to Iraqis, but he was, as Powell said, in his box. And if we had left him in his box, Iraq would be a terrible, miserable place, as it is today. It would maybe be worse or slightly better, but in any case, it would be sort of like what it was. There was the erosion of the sanctions. So one might have concentrated on trying to shore up the sanctions, but you could imagine Iraq staying pretty much the same, in which case the U.S. freedom of action for doing things in other spaces would be much larger, I believe. And I don't think otherwise the situation in the region would change that much. That's separate from the question, what could you buy for your $1 trillion, which is, that $1 trillion sounds like real money, yes.
Let me read in here. I mean, the Congress did not appropriate $1 trillion, so I don't want anyone to leave here thinking that. I mean,
$60 billion so far.
You're halfway there. But I think
but-
what you really need to do is to start thinking about the actual money that was appropriated and where could that have gone, not the question of Congress sitting back and talking about, well, if before this is over, we're going to spend trillions of dollars, so let's do that. Well, what's going to happen to the national debt if we do that? I would tell you right now, where I hope a lot of this money goes, I hope it goes into saving Social Security, because that's what we need to be doing. That's what the Congress needs to be doing with the money, is investing now so that young people will have the same type of retirement as the old folks do, my generation has, as far as receiving Social Security and being able to depend upon it, and it can be done.
Lydia, your final point, to make sure you have your fair share, you're saying 660 has been appropriated?
$660 billion has been appropriated. If you look at the cost that we already will have to pay, even if we leave Iraq, even if we pull out completely tomorrow, in terms of long-term military replenishments and long-term medical care and disability benefits to veterans who have already fought, you easily exceed $1 trillion, not just according to our study, but according to the Congressional Budget Office already. For that amount of money, you could make Social Security solvent for the next 75 years.
So your point is that in addition to the appropriated funds, there are promissory notes which
That's
get
right.
us to the trillion. Well, that is quite a broad-ranging discussion of a topic on which there is not a consensus. But in the tradition of the Kennedy School, we tried to shed sometimes light and avoid heat and hope that the process of analysis may make better policies in the future. And that's why we're here, why you're here. And all that's left for this evening is for you to thank the panel for the job they've done.